Tonight on Nation to Nation, we're at the AFN Special Chiefs Assembly in Ottawa. A hot topic is new Indigenous child welfare legislation, as there's a lot on the line.
I believe getting it right on this will save lives.
But it's not the only piece of legislation coming up. The Indigenous Languages Act is also expected next month.
I'm going to push the members of Parliament and Cabinet to get it done, passed through that House.
And there's a settlement for residential school survivors, but it's not for day scholars.
There is a sense of urgency for all of us in these childhood litigations. We need to work together.
Hello, I'm Todd Lamoran, and welcome to Nation to Nation. We're here in Ottawa at the Assembly of First Nations Special Chiefs Gathering. And just moments ago, Chiefs heard from the Indigenous Services Minister. Jane Philpott spoke about new child welfare legislation. The feds want to hand over authority of Indigenous child welfare to First Nations, Métis, and Inuit. And the hope is that this will save lives by keeping children at home. There's a lot more to do. That's why I'm here, joined by Minister Philpott. Welcome to Nation to Nation.
Thank you for having me.
Now, of course, the APTN News broke this last week about this new child welfare legislation. But what does that mean when we're talking about handing over power to Indigenous people?
Well, as you know, this is something that we've been hearing from for decades, really. One of the calls to action of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, call to action number 4, said there should be federal legislation, and it should establish national principles around child and family services, but also that it should affirm the rights of First Nations to exercise the jurisdiction that they already have on child and family services. So those will be established through legislation. There will be a lot of work to do at the implementation level. We have obviously put lots of new resources behind this through the 2018 budget to make sure that communities have access to resources to support keeping their kids at home. But the legislation will make it very clear that as we work with provinces and territories, as we work directly with First Nations, that they in fact can go ahead and exercise that jurisdiction, and there should not be any challenges associated with that.
Is there some line or one thing in this proposed legislation that's going to do that, or flip the switch, I suppose, so that Indigenous people do take control?
Well, that's an excellent question, because of the way that we have been advised through the conversations we've had across the country with literally thousands of people, First Nations as well as Inuit and Métis Nation, is that it should be optional for communities. Some may choose to continue with things as is. Some of them are working with either First Nations agencies or with other provincial delegated agencies, and some communities may choose to continue that, and they certainly may. But for those who want to latch on to this opportunity to exercise jurisdiction, that will be very clearly laid out in the legislation.
Well, we talked about, a lot of people at the mic talked about the Spirit Bear plan. Why not just adopt the Spirit Bear plan? Is this legislation going to look kind of similar to that?
Well, you know, the Spirit Bear plan speaks to a range of sectors, whether it be education, healthcare, and child and family services, and that's in fact the work of my department, is to do all of those things and to close those gaps. So certainly we are always interested in hearing the good advice of the Child and Family Caring Society and the work that they have done, and it very much informs the work that we're doing.
I listened to your speech this morning, and you talked a lot about how a lot of socioeconomic problems stem from children being scooped and taken out of their homes. So I take it that you think this is a key, this is a linchpin to stopping this. Is that correct? Am I correct on that?
Well, you know, everything's interrelated. So I think, you know, focusing on the children, as we heard this morning about the words of Elder Elmer, who passed this morning, who said, don't forget the little ones. If we focus on the children, keep the children in their homes and communities, that actually is critical to the healing of nations, to the rebuilding of strong, resilient nations. But everything's tied in together, because you can't take care of those children if you don't have the economic opportunities, the decent housing, access to clean water. So in a sense, it needs to be addressed in a comprehensive way, but certainly if if we can look to what is in the best interest of the child and support children and families, that will go a long way to making sure that we see a new day of those strong rebuilt nations.
I guess the bottom line, do you think this will save lives? I know this always takes time, but can we say in 3 to 5 years we won't have any more suicide crises, for example?
Well, 3 to 5 years in the big picture of things may be a relatively short period of time, but I believe getting it right on this will save lives. I heard, as we did the engagement across the country, I heard what happens to these children who grow up entangled in the foster care system, who age out of care, who literally get sent out into the streets, and they become targets of people who are trafficking, of people who are seeking to take advantage of those vulnerable youth. And I think if we can keep children at home and never set them on that dangerous path, that it will be, in fact, life-saving.
Do you foresee then that when you hand over this to First Nations communities, that the chiefs and councils will be the ones who be driving this going forward?
We are seeing some really strong work being done in a number of communities. Generally, politicians aren't the ones who actually administer these kinds of services, but they then have the choice to say what kind of an institution do they want within their community or in their nation. And so we're seeing, I point you to an agreement that we had this year with Huayet, which is one of the self-governing First Nations in British Columbia. We're doing some really important work and have designed an entire system and developing something that works for them based on their tradition, based on their culture. And chiefs and council will obviously take a leading role in designing what those systems will look like.
You mentioned that usually politics doesn't get involved, they might drive the overall issue, but don't get involved in the little details of it. So are we talking about replacing a non-Indigenous person coming to take a kid out of a home with an Indigenous person who's basically just doing the same function?
Well, no, in fact, the kinds of vision that we're seeing across the community is saying it should be an entirely different model, that the agency or organization that a community may choose to work with should be focused not on the apprehension of children, but on what do families need. So if there is a child that's perceived to be at risk for some reason, what does that family need to be able to support the healthy upbringing of that child? Is there a health issue in the parents that needs to be addressed, and how can we make sure those parents get access to treatment? Is there someone other than the parents who could perhaps for a time take care of the children, whether it be an aunt or a grandmother, for example? Moving to a system that says the best interest of the child needs to be the driving principle. How can we make sure that that child's interests are met, and how can we avoid, if at all possible, apprehending that child and taking them away from their community?
Of course, earlier the Prime Minister said this legislation is going to be tabled in January. The House is going to go on its Christmas break for a while. You don't come back till the end of January, so you basically got between then and June to get this passed. How possible is this?
Nothing is impossible. So we are going to work very hard. I think this legislation has very strong support, certainly from First Nations, Inuit and Métis Nation leaders. So as we work through the parliamentary process, I hope that other parliamentarians will see the importance of this and will be supportive. And we've certainly heard really good response from senators who are very enthusiastic about this. And I hope that we will be able to get it through as quickly as we can.
If this does get passed before the next federal election, I guess where does this rank on achievements for your government?
There is nothing more important than children. So I think this is one of the most important pieces of legislation of our government. I'm thankful for the privilege of being involved in it. I think, like I said, this should mark a turning point. I hope Canadians are paying attention and listening. This is not just about Indigenous peoples. This is important to the future of Canada. The Indigenous youth of this country are the fastest growing segment of our population. If we can't do right by those children and shift our policies and practices into a pattern that supports the healthy upbringing of those children, then the whole country will suffer. We have to do right by those children. It's really important.
Okay, Minister Philpott, that's it. I want to thank you for spending some time talking to us. Thank you.
Thank you.
We'll have more from the Assembly of First Nations after a short break. Please stay with us. Welcome back. Right after our interview with Minister Philpott, news broke outside the main hall here. The Executive Director of the First Nations Child and Family Caring Society, Cindy Blackstock, shared a letter with media, and it involves the Canadian Human Rights Tribunal decision on child welfare back in January 2016. Canada and Blackstock are far apart on compensation. The Assembly of First Nations is a party to that tribunal fight, and we're now joined by National Chief Perry Bellegarde. Welcome to Nation to Nation.
Good to be here.
Now, the tribunal ruled that kids should be compensated by the feds for years of mistreatment, of discrimination, I should say. And it worked out for about $1.4 billion, but the government said it has no mandate to pay. What's going on here?
Well, again, we support the position that all children that have faced discrimination and or abuse in whatever system that was there, on reserve or off reserve, should be looked at for compensation in a very respectful way. We've dealt with two issues now. We dealt with discrimination and racism that was espoused through the CHRT ruling decisions a few years back, that there was discrimination. And so we pushed the government hard to make sure the resources flowed out to those delegated agencies across Canada. That's one piece. Now we've got 40,000 children in foster care, in provincial care, and territorial government care. That issue has to be dealt with, and so that's why we're pushing on the First Nations or the Indigenous Child Welfare Act, because that we've got to occupy that field and space and jurisdiction. Ultimately, again, the provinces and territories move out, and then the First Nations jurisdiction where their children will expand and move into. So that's what we've got to focus on, is the children, both on reserve and off reserve.
But have you heard anything about the tribunal, about this compensation ruling from the federal government? Why they seem to be dragging their heels on this?
Well, we got to push federal government. Again, if you got a binding tribunal, you use the CHRT decision, right? It's a binding decision. And so our job is to push government to make sure it's implemented and honored. And we're going to keep doing that.
I suppose, is this kind of the last part of this historical tribunal's job, or can we finally dust our hands of this and move on?
Well, I think the children are too important. You know, that until there is justice, until there is the same quality of services and programs on and off reserve for these children that are in care, nobody can stop. No federal government, no provincial government, no First Nations government can stop until those children are provided the same hope and the same opportunity as every other child in Canada. So it's going to take everybody working together, and that's the whole challenge going forward. If you focus on the children and making sure that they have that hope and opportunity that everybody else has, we're not going to go wrong. We're the fastest growing segment of Canada's population, young First Nations men and women. It's very important, not only for our people and our families and communities and nations, but for Canada as a country, because you've got an aging workforce. You've got a human capital pool that should be invested in and tapped in, and you're getting huge returns on investment if you do that.
Now, Crown Indigenous Relations Minister Carolyn Bennett spoke on day one of the Assembly about an announcement coming up on specific claims, but she had to come back and clarify. What exactly was it that she was clarifying?
We've asked our Chiefs Committee that deals with specific claims, had a meeting with her yesterday and asked her to come back to the Assembly, which she did today, to clarify her comments. And her comments were clear that when we work together and co-develop, whether legislation or policies, it really should be a co-developed process. And so when she said there was a piece of work that was done in partnership and co-developed, the chiefs were saying that really wasn't the case. We worked together on an MC over a year ago, but the new policy framework or the new MC or anything that was being worked on wasn't done jointly. So she came back and clarified that. But she also clarified that she wants to work together with the chiefs and the rights and title holders and our APTN Chiefs Committee that has the responsibility for that file or that policy. And so we've got some work to do to roll up our sleeves, work together to amend that policy and fix it, because currently I always said there's 4 policies we need to fix: comprehensive claims, specific claims, additions to reserve, and the inherent right to self-government policy, currently they're based on termination of rights and title, not recognition of rights and title. So they need to be fixed. The Prime Minister committed to a comprehensive law and policy review, so he needs to instruct his cabinet ministers to work with us in partnership to fix those 4 policies. That's what we heard here today when she came back to the Assembly of Chiefs and indicated that. So we look forward to working with her and her team to get that done.
Now, the Prime Minister, of course, spoke here again, as he does every year. He made a commitment to table legislation on child welfare that Philpott had mentioned, and on something that you've been pushing for a long time, an Indigenous Languages Act, tabled in January. Of course, January, they go for their summer break in June, so they only have that period of time to get this done before our next election. Can this get done?
I'm going to push the members of Parliament and Cabinet to get it done, passed through that House. I've met with the senators, the independent senators, to work with them because they've got to also agree to this and get it passed. So we've got to have a very clear, specific strategy with the House of Commons, to get this legislation passed, and with the Senate. So I'm going to believe in my heart, mind, and soul that this can get done because the Indigenous Languages Act is so fundamental and so key for our survival as Indigenous peoples. It's, even studies have shown that young First Nations people, when they're fluent in their language, they know who they are, where they come from, they're more successful in school and therefore more successful in life. So even this is an investment in human capital, but it's ultimately linked to our right to self-determination, our own languages, lands, laws, people, and government. And so it's fundamental. And I think the Crown, and believe the Crown, has an obligation to put as much energy, time, and resources, both human and financial, to preserve and revitalize and bring back fluency in our languages as they spent on trying to eradicate them through the residential schools. So this is important. I think we can get it done. It's very important.
What else absolutely has to get passed, get royal assent before we head into another election?
Well, child welfare is the other one we want to see get done. And we've got 40,000 provincial care. And we've got to set up those processes in bilats, province by province, territory by territory. That's so important because, again, it's children. We've got to get that done. And then 262, Bill C-262 is another important piece of legislation. That's the implementation of the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. Very important that we want to see that done. And then we've even got work on treaty implementation, treaty enforcement, according to spirit and intent. There's so much we have to get done because ultimately the treaty relationship with the Crown was based on sharing the land and resource wealth. We've never given up anything, but we're to mutually benefit from sharing all the land and resource wealth in Canada. But yet we don't see that happening. We see Canada up here, quality of life 6, First Nations people were 63rd. So until we start delaying or start sharing the land and resource wealth, this gap has to close. So we need to deal with that as well.
I noticed in the grand entry you had 3 Conservative members of Parliament. They're the ones who sit on the Indigenous Affairs, Standing Committee on Indigenous Affairs. I'm talking about Cathy McLeod, Arnold Viersen, Kevin Waugh. Are you hedging your bets or making bridges to a possible Andrew Scheer government?
Well, it's like my job is to work with whoever gets elected. And October is coming of 2019. We don't know who will get elected. So we build relationships with all the leaders of the parties, with Justin Trudeau, who's leader of the Liberal Party, and he's Prime Minister of Canada. We have relationships, and we need to work with Andrew Scheer, the Conservative Party leader, Jagmeet Singh, NDP, Elizabeth May with the Greens. We build relationships. That's what it's all about, because we need to influence all policy, all legislations that impact on inherent rights, treaty rights, Aboriginal rights, and title. So it just makes sense. So they're going to be coming here tomorrow as well. So we build that relationship. That's what it's all about.
Is there enough momentum now, you think, on policy and legislation that if you got a change in government, for example, Bill C-262 does get passed, is there enough momentum that we get another change in government that they won't come along and undo that work, or undo any of the other work that perhaps the Trudeau government has done?
Well, again, we don't know what's going to happen in October. No matter what happens, again, we know that our relationship is with the Crown. We have treaties with the Crown. We don't have treaties with the Liberals or the Conservatives or Greens or NDP. We have a treaty relationship with the Crown, high up. And it's also a sanctity of agreement and sanctity of contract with that treaty relationship. We need that honored, respected, and implemented now. We still have unextinguished title to the resources beneath the depth of a plow. We still have Aboriginal rights and title to land and territories. So governments need to know that. Everybody needs to know that. Canadians need to know that. That First Nations people, again, we say it sometimes, we're the first order of government, but yet there's only two systems of law that are recognized in Canada: common law, civil law. There's also First Nations law, creators law, natural law. So there's got to be space and room for that. So after, if there's a change in government, we still have inherent rights. We still have treaties. So no matter who gets in, they've got to live by and abide by those agreements. And so that's our work, is to educate everybody, including Canadians across Canada, about the importance of that.
National Chief, it's always a pleasure. Thank you again for being on Nation to Nation.
Thanks for the opportunity.
And after the break, we put questions to Carolyn Bennett over the Day Scholars class action lawsuit we told you about in Kamloops last week. Welcome back. Last week we were in Kamloops and told you about a class action lawsuit involving Indian residential school day scholars and their fight for a settlement from the federal government. Today, Ottawa did settle a lawsuit, but not for those day scholars. No, it was for survivors of Indian day schools. Here's Crown Indigenous Relations Minister Carolyn Bennett with that announcement.
Unlike the Indian residential school settlement, which Canada managed, that there will be an administrator appointed that the claimants agree with, that will then deal with the actually execution of the settlement, and also the details of the $200 million in the healing and language funds.
But what about day scholars, the people who attended actual residential schools? This is what Minister Bennett said just a few days ago.
We're working hard with the plaintiffs, and I mean we want to negotiate and not be in court. So it's very important to the survivors and their descendants, and we're working very well at the table.
Because dozens and dozens have died waiting, and it's been in court for about 6 years. Many more are, time's kind of running out. Is there a sense of urgency to get a settlement?
There is a sense of urgency for all of us. In these childhood litigations, we need to work together. I think we've been able to obviously it's the 1 year anniversary of the Anderson apology and us settling with a community that wasn't even in Canada at the time, but we think it's the right thing to do to settle these claims, and we're working very hard to do that.
What would you say to the people who, there's people who are involved heavily in in litigation, but those who are just calling the people who are involved and going, when are we going to get a settlement? What would you say to those people who are waiting?
That we are working in the best way possible, and that we also know that is the settlement, like with 60 Scoop, is quite often more than just the settlement that a court could award. That when you come to the table, we're able to work on healing, on language and culture, on the kinds of things that Chief Marshal Brown talked about when that they were awarded the court settlement. They want more than that. People lost their language and culture, were harmed and need healing, and that's how we want to be able to put together a proper package for the survivors and their descendants.
Next week, the inquiry into missing and murdered Indigenous women will be in Ottawa. What's next as it gets ready to prepare its report? And if you missed any part of tonight's show, you can check out our podcasts. Go to aptnnews.ca/podcast. I'm Todd Lamoran. Thanks for watching.